Haidete o Filoi. I'm Fletcher from amindforlanguage.com, and you're listening to Greeking Out, a podcast for ancient and Koine Greek learners full of tools, tips, and possibly tirades on learning Greek using comprehension-based methods. If that isn't familiar to you, check out episode 0, The Manifesto, for more info. Today I'm chatting with Colin Gorrie, and we're not talking about Greek. Actually, we're talking about Old English. Why, you ask? Well, good question. Colin is developing a comprehensible input-based textbook for Old English, and he's also teaching it using communicative methods with the Ancient Language Institute. You see, Old English is even more of a niche language than Ancient Greek is, and so I think there's a lot of things here that we can apply to our own learning journeys, even if it's not the same language. Collins also does stuff on YouTube about constructed languages and just linguistics in general. He's a really cool guy, and this was a great conversation. So I think you'll really enjoy it. Our conversation ranges, as usual, from his story, learning his ancient language. We talk about fantasy literature, the book he's working on for Old English, his teaching, and again, there's a lot of good things that we can learn here and apply to our own journey. Earbuds ready? Let's jump in. So hi, Colin. It's great to have you on.
Oh, an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I know it took us a little while to get all the schedules worked out. I was traveling and you've been traveling, and so it's great. It's finally managed to happen. So you're a little bit, you'll be probably the only person I'll interview on this podcast about this, because you're doing Old English rather than Greek as your primary language, right?
Yeah, that's right. Old English is not a language that's typically taught via comprehensible input methods, and I've been trying to adapt those for use with Old English.
So I want to get into how you actually learned Old English, but it looks like, correct me if I'm wrong, you're teaching right now and kind of developing something that looks a little bit like Lingua Latina per se illustrata, but for Old English. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. So it's so the book is called Oswald the Bear, and it's a reader that's very much similar to Familia Romana in the Lingua Latina per se illustrata series. So it's similar in the sense that it starts from a very, very basic level with very introducing vocabulary, sort of dripping new vocabulary out a little bit at a time, gradually increasing the complexity of the structures, and it sort of teaches the language all through the medium of a developing story.
Right, which from my limited use of Lingua Latina seems to be what it's doing, and just correct me if I'm wrong, seems to be a really great method for acquiring ancient languages where you don't have speakers you can go have beginning conversations with and then move up to more advanced kind of things.
Yes, it as far as I can tell, it's the gold standard for learning ancient languages. I think it would actually work pretty well for a modern language too, but we also have the benefit of having people we can talk to, native speakers and things like that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm kind of struggling to learn Korean at the moment, and I wish there was a Lingua Latina for that. That would be amazing. So how did you get started with Old English? What got you interested?
Yeah, it's a sort of strange series of events. I had my first ancient language was Latin, which I learned back in high school, and I learned it the old-fashioned way, the sort of grammar translation method. Sitting in class and having the teacher. Was an amazing teacher, but he had this sort of Magister Wiley. He had this habit of turning to us and saying gender number case, and it's masculine dative plural. Why? Because it's the indirect object of it. So we had that experience, which definitely did get us to a high level in the language, but we had this common problem that I think a lot of learners of ancient languages have, where the whole experience of reading primary text feels a little bit like a Sudoku puzzle.
Yeah.
You're just, finding the verb, you get your little highlighters out, marking things in the same color that agree, and it's not a smooth and it's not like reading in our first languages or in other modern languages that we know really well. And so, I put that to the side, and I ended up studying linguistic theory for my sort of academic life. And after a while, after grad school, I had thought, is there some way of applying some of the things we know about how language works in the mind to studying these ancient languages? And lo and behold, I wasn't the first person to ask that question, not by a long shot. There'd been people who've been working on this for decades. And so I immersed myself in that literature and started to learn all about how second language acquisition theory has been applied to the study and teaching of ancient languages, and to really great results, I think, especially with Latin, and also to a certain extent with ancient Greek. I think there are fewer resources for Greek, but they're definitely coming along. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to try this with some other languages?
Hmm.
And I thought, which one should I do? And I looked onto my bookshelf and I saw that an old grammar of Old English that I'd picked up at a garage sale many years ago. And I thought, I've never really managed to sit down and go through this and really understand what it's like to read Old English. And I sort of bootstrapped my way into this story-based approach by taking the old-fashioned materials, the grammar translation materials, using it to teach myself, and then building up and starting to write this story and develop it over the years as I've learned the language better and tweaked parts here and there. So it's been a kind of eat your own dog food kind of method.
Okay. Man, that's really interesting. I mean, the vast majority of people I've interviewed on here started in a similar way. It's the grammar translation in high school or college for one of their first ancient languages, and then switched somehow to either using, like, learning through communicative methods or using it as a teaching method. But it sounds like you're following that same pattern, but then uh, using it for Old English, a language that not many people are teaching really.
Hmm. Not many people are teaching, period. and then
Right.
not and then virtually no one is teaching, to my knowledge, using these kinds of methods. So it's been really instructive to see what the process looks like when you're developing the materials more or less from scratch.
Mm.
And it's just been a real vote of confidence for the methods, these methods that focus around getting lots of input into students, comprehensible input in particular, and you can just see the process work with students, and it gives I never doubted the literature or anything like that, but it's one thing to read about it, and it's another thing to see it happen.
So, so you said like you kind of eat your own dog food, right? As you're learning. So you're working. So let me just get my head around this. So you have this old grammar and you're working through that, and then you're kind of writing stories. And how exactly does that feed into you learning through comprehensible methods? Like play that out for me a little more.
Yeah, so in the early days, I'd say read a passage. So the typical way that Old English is taught, it's a little bit different than the traditional way that, say, Latin or I think ancient Greek is taught. Um, you get a book. They're usually Victorian textbooks. They have a grammar of the language in the front, and then they have a selection of texts in the back. And
Hmm.
the pedagogy is read the grammar, memorize it, and then read the texts.
Okay.
And, I think probably listeners know that that doesn't stand a great chance of working, and it's very frustrating.
Right.
But it can be done if you spend enough time doing it. And so what I did was I just sort of banged my head against the wall with that approach, and then I would go and try and apply it by doing some composition of my own and starting to write little stories. Or I would take texts and simplify them and rewrite them in prose using only common vocabulary. And then I would leave them to the side, read more. I would say, okay, interesting. I've found a new construction that better expresses this meaning that I wanted to use in one of my compositions. So I'd go back to my composition, I would change it. And it built up to a point that I could just start reading basically any text and have that more or less immediate understanding that I have in modern English. And that happened over a relatively short period of time, still measured in the years, but not too many of them. And I thought, oh, okay, if I could do this using sort of methods that I've bricolaged together, how much easier would it be for students if they had a sort of a nice flat paved road to go on?
Right.
And so that's what Oswald Bera was born from, is the need to, the desire to take the sort of winding path that I took in my own learning and smooth it out and make it a little easier for students to go down.
So so just to reiterate, it sounds like what you did is you took less than ideal resources, which you described that, and I immediately thought of some Greek books I've got, like Clyde Farr's Homeric Greek textbook, which is very similar. Like the chapter is here's a bunch of bullet points that refer to the and numbers that refer to the grammar chapter. Memorize this, and then learn this vocab. Read these sections. So you took like less than ideal materials, kind of worked through them, and then like say you finish a chapter there, and then you start writing a story or adapting a text that's in one of the readings, but to tell a different story using similar vocab or something like that. Am I reiterating that well?
Yeah, that's right. So, for example, the big, I think the big goal for a lot of Old English speakers or a lot of Old English learners is to read Beowulf. And so
Right.
I took Beowulf, I took sections of Beowulf, some scenes, and I would try and rewrite them. Beowulf is written in verse, and so I would rewrite them in prose, and I
Mm,
would take the poetic vocabulary and replace it with more prosaic vocabulary, and then I would use that as my little composition exercise. And then I actually started in those very early days teaching with some of that material too, more casually. Um, not with this whole curriculum in mind, but just as a way of getting started and helping some people who also wanted to take some first steps in Old English. And then it sort of snowballed from there. As I was able to handle more and more complex texts, I was able to write more and more without feeling that I was on thin ice.
mm,
And the process I think still continues to this day. As I read more and more
right.
in the original literature, I'll find a great turn of phrase, and I'll think, okay, I've got to use that in Oswald because it's exactly what I want to express here. Or I might find that a term that I've been using is wrong for the time period that I'm setting the story. So there's
Mm,
a constant period, there's a constant process of tweaking and polishing, but by and large, you get to a point where your model of the language in your mind is a sufficient fit to the language as it existed that you can start to, and I'll switch metaphors here, you can start to sort of cross the river on that bridge, even though it might be a little rickety in places.
right. But ultimately that's kind of what we're doing learning any ancient language because we're not native speakers. So we're always encountering things that may not match up exactly with how we think the language works. Um, and especially I think with ancient Greek, like when we say ancient Greek, we're referring to hundreds and hundreds of years of material, which languages change. And there was a lot going on in the ancient world and contacts between empires and things. They could change quite quickly. Um, so, I mean, it's not, you're kind of, I think with ancient Greek, especially, we're kind of building multiple bridges across the river, across potentially multiple rivers, hoping they all get us to the place we're trying to go. So
Mm-hmm.
that, um, yeah, that makes sense. And it sounds really interesting too, because you're getting, I think, composition in much earlier than a lot of ancient language learners might necessarily want to do. But that's one of your four skills that we need is to learn a language in a well-rounded way. It sounds like I'm assuming you probably felt like, okay, I've learned something, I've read a text, and now I've written it, and now it probably felt like you've cemented some of those pieces of grammar and new structures in your mind. Um, I would think probably fairly quickly.
Exactly. I've found the composition to be an extraordinarily helpful thing. Um, with my own students, I use composition in a slightly different way, given that the typical demographic of people I teach are not necessarily language professionals in some sense, but they're interested, they're professionals in other domains who have a strong interest in learning the language. And so instead of having them do written composition, we do what you might call oral composition in class. So
Mm,
the classes are structured. So I teach at the Ancient Language Institute,
mhm,
teach Old English and Latin there, and the way the classes are structured is we read a chapter of the text together and in class. So I'll have the students read different, maybe one paragraph each, read this paragraph, and then we talk about it in Old English. We talk about what happened in that paragraph. I'll ask some questions. What did you think about this character? Do you think he should be trusted? And what I'm doing by asking those questions is prompt, trying to prompt certain replies. I'm
Hmm.
not, it's not, I'm not looking for these exact words, but I'm giving opportunities to use a construction, or I'm giving opportunities to use a particular vocabulary item. And what I've found, and I think I'm not alone in this, is that having a need to know something makes you much more receptive to acquiring it.
Yeah.
So I'll give an example using vocabulary. I think it's a pretty common thing to experience that you don't always learn a vocabulary item on the first meeting. Sometimes it takes dozens of
Yeah.
meetings for particularly thorny words. But if you have if you are sort of in the moment and you really want to express a concept and you don't know it, that almost primes your mind to be very receptive to getting that answer. And you can have this almost one-shot learning where you see a vocabulary item once, and just from seeing it once in this heightened state of receptiveness, you've learned it. And
Mm.
so the composition exercises, I think that's a big factor in why composition is so successful as a learning strategy. And that's how I try to incorporate that into the classes without giving an excessive burden of students having to write, and of course teachers having to grade that. So I think that oral composition in class is a really I don't want to say underutilized, but I mean, I'll say underutilized. I think I could even use it more. That's how effective it is.
And I think that oral strategy makes a lot of sense because, having just written some Greek stuff and messing around with it, like since I'm assuming your Old English text is using thorns and other characters that are not on standard, most standard keyboards. So now we have the
Mhm.
additional burden of the student, in addition to having to grapple with the language, has to learn how to type and deal with ancient language keyboards can be good, bad, difficult. I don't know what's out there for Old English and if it's pleasant to use or not, but that's just another thing they have to interact with and have to learn how to use. And I know for Greek, it's typing in Greek is a pain because of all the accents and things. And I guess with Old English, maybe you don't have to deal with quite so much, but still.
Not as many as Greek. I find typing Greek to be difficult. Without the accents, it'd be great, but those little, at least on my keyboard layout, the accents are all sort of clustered in one spot, and some are you have to do shift, and I never remember what's what.
Yeah.
Um, but with Old English, it's not quite so bad. We have long vowels, which are marked with a macron or an acute. We have thorn, which is it looks like a combination between a lowercase b and a lowercase p, which stands for the th sound. And we have a few other characters, the ash, the AE ligature,
Mhm.
which, these are things that are not on your standard English keyboard, but depending on what kind of software you're using, there are more or less easy ways to do it. But still, I tell students in emails, if you can't find thorn, write th. I mean, that actually is found in some manuscripts as well. So I think that's really not the thing that we want to be challenging.
Right.
There's enough challenge in learning the grammar and learning the vocabulary of a language. These are sort of small ancillary things that if we can make them easier, let's make them easier. And so oral composition has that benefit where you don't have to struggle to find the character on the keyboard because it just comes out of your
Okay.
mouth.
So I'm imagining that crafting those questions as a teacher, crafting the questions to elicit those things, that probably takes quite a bit of thought and effort.
It's something that I typically so I do a combination of pre-planned questions and sort of on the spot improvisation. And I think it's good to mix these two. I think obviously as a teacher, it's a lot easier to sit down beforehand, come up with a list of questions and just say them in class. But there's something to the live energy
Hmm.
of coming up with questions that you want to see where the discussion takes you. Students could become really interested in one character and want to explore his motives, or they might be interested in a bit of historical context that comes up from the story. So in writing Oswald Bera, I've tried to I've tried to include a lot of historical Easter eggs,
Mm,
historical and literary Easter eggs, so that it can also be not only an introduction to the Old English language, but an introduction to the history of Anglo-Saxon England and the sort of literary genres that you see when you get into that literature. So the book is sort of set up episodically where our hero Oswald goes on different adventures, and each adventure is sort of takes place in kind of within one of the genres of Old English literature. So he spends some time at a monastery and he learns. You get this sort of Old English prose style where works of, say, grammar, where someone's explaining these are the different declensions and these are the different cases, and we have this stuff in Old English.
hmm
And he's sort of sitting there in class, saying, trying to find exceptions and prove the teacher wrong, and these sort of things. So by the time you've read that, when you go to read an author like Alfric, who wrote a great many things, but one of them is the Colloquy on the Professions, which is sort of a Latin textbook. It's a dialogue between a teacher and some students about what the best profession is, and it was originally in Latin, but we have an Old English gloss because it was made for Old English speakers learning Latin. And in that dialogue, you see different names for different professions showing up in all the different cases of Latin,
Mm.
and so it's in itself an interesting pedagogical text. But you are introduced to this by the fact that you've sort of seen it in miniature in Oswald. And similarly, you see Oswald go into battle against the Danes, and you get ready for texts like the Battle of Malden, which is on the same topic. So I think that's a useful thing to include in the material, because it sparks up all sorts of discussions in class where students ask, what was the Dane law? Why were the Danes in England? And then we can talk about that in Old English. Maybe not in the first few weeks, but soon enough.
Yeah. So, all right. So, I mean, I guess anytime we're learning an ancient language, we're time traveling, but we're learning an ancient version of our own. I mean, I'm an English speaker. Assume you're an American as well. So, um,
Close
we're
enough. I'm a Canadian.
Canadian. Sorry, why didn't I even think to ask that? Yeah. So, still, you probably have a little more French in your background than I might, but native English speakers. And I know our case system is all but dead. And at this point in the history of the language, but we're backing up to a period where I'm assuming we don't have all the Latin roots and things in there. Like how different is Old English from from modern English, and what does it feel like studying something that feels like it should be recognizable but probably isn't quite?
Yeah, it's a really delightful mixture of the foreign and the familiar.
Mm,
So as you said, Old English has a lot less of the Latin influence compared to modern English. Now, it's not that it has none. There's actually a fair few. There are a fair few Latin loanwords in Old English, but we don't have that massive dose of French that we get in the Middle English period. And then the massive dose of Latin that we get in the early modern period with this sort of international philosophical and scientific vocabulary. So we have a much more Germanic, English is a Germanic language, but Old English, you can see that much more obviously. The vocabulary stock is overwhelmingly Germanic, shared with the other Germanic languages, the Scandinavian languages, German, and so on. You also do have a case system, which is not as robust and involved as that of Latin, Greek, or Sanskrit, but you have basically four cases which have their distinct forms and are very much not optional and are often quite important for understanding what goes on in the sentence. We have a freer word order. So a lot of things
mm,
that make that we're familiar with from if we've studied other Indo-European languages, especially older Indo-European languages like Latin and ancient Greek, you start to see that in a language that looks a lot like English. And so it's a very strange experience to see these things that you associate with these classical languages operating with vocabulary that looks very similar in some cases. In some cases, it doesn't look that similar. My favorite example in Old English is Nerksnawang. Nerksnawang means paradise.
okay.
And it's my example. People say, oh, choose Anglo-Saxon roots, Anglo-Saxon words. They're nice and short. And I think, well, they're not all that short. Merksnabang. Um, Although, etymologically that was originally two words. Nevertheless, it sort of shows up on its own. Merksnabang all the time. It's a lovely word. I'd love to see an X in the middle there.
Yeah, if you said that word to me, I would never have guessed that was Old English. Um, yeah, I'm not sure what I would have gone with, but yeah, that's crazy. Interesting. So I guess just selling, not selling Old English, but what else can we read in it? I mean, again, I'm more of my life has been in Greek and things like that. So I know of Beowulf. I have a really cool edition of it with Seamus Heaney's translation facing the Old English, which I can make almost nothing of. But like, so what else do we have? You mentioned a dialogue text earlier, which I've already forgotten.
Yeah, Alfred's colloquy on the
Alfred.
professions is that. So Alfred has, so we can divide Old English literature sort of in a two by two. So there's the prose and the poetic works, and
Mhm.
then there's the religious and the secular. So we see a lot in each of those four quadrants. People I think are most familiar with the secular poetry. So Beowulf is an example of that. But we also have religious poetry. We have a text that I'm working a lot with right now, which is the Andreas, which is a sort of an Old English heroic poem about the life of Saint Andrew,
Okay.
and it's very similar in many ways to Beowulf. A lot of these stories are adapted for the Anglo-Saxon psyche, so you have these saints going and they're presented as these kind of conquering heroes, and you have a lot of the same poetic devices used as in Beowulf. Even the very first line in the poem is very, very similar to Beowulf, which has this device of saying, we've heard in ancient times about the deeds of these noble princes, more or less like that. And Andreas also starts with very, very similar, a very, very similar, almost like it's kind of like an invocation.
Huh.
This So it's very interesting to see the similarities between the religious and the secular poetry. The elegiac poems, the most famous are the Wanderer and the Seafarer. So these are poems that talk about the transitory nature of life, and they're beautiful and justly famous, and relatively short. So those are well loved. In terms of the prose, we have translations of the Gospels. We have translations of several other books of the Bible. Not a complete translation. We have many homilies, especially by Alfred. He was a very, very prolific writer,
Hmm.
who wrote towards the end of the period. In terms of secular prose, we have things like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. We have many law codes, and these are probably the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is of interest to students of history. We have lots of things like law codes and wills that are interesting to perhaps researchers more than the general audience. But we also have lovely travelogues about that tell us a lot of ethnographic information about people who lived around the Baltic Sea, and there's lots. It really opens up a window onto this period of history, because English is sort of unique amongst the Germanic languages in that it was written fairly early on in history. So it's
Ah,
one of the earliest attested Germanic languages, Old English. Gothic is before it, but after that, the flourishing of other Germanic languages literatures come later than that of Old English. So it's really great for learning about sort of linguistic history of the Germanic languages, as well as the history of the Germanic peoples.
so actually, that was one of the questions that occurred to me when you were talking about these poems and things. Is um, were many of these things originally composed orally and later written, like we think may have happened with Homer, or was it originally written documents? And I guess it varies by which quadrant of the literature we're in and what how close to the beginning or end of the period. But
Yes. Yeah. Well, okay. So I'll say for the poems that people are most famous. So Beowulf is the big one that has a question mark over it. Was this written? Was this a written composition? Was this an oral composition that was later written down? When was it written? By whom? Under what circumstances? These are very, very hotly debated questions. So we still don't really know. the answers to these questions. There are arguments on both sides of the sort of oral versus written composition for Beowulf, but so I can't give a definitive answer on that. This is something that, this is the kind of thing that people throw chairs at each other in
Right.
conferences over. So I'm not going to say anything, but just to say that it's an open question. But the prose works are largely the prose works are translations of in many cases the prose works are translations of Latin texts.
Mm,
So they were certainly written
okay.
compositions, but there is some evidence that some of the poetry is a very early date, or at least some parts of the poems are a very early date from certain grammatical characteristics and weird nerd details about the precise workings of the meter that we can work out. But yeah, not everyone accepts all of those arguments.
So again, another connection in my mind as I listen to you talk about the literature. I'm a huge fantasy nerd, fantasy fan, like Lewis, Tolkien. I know a lot of those guys, professors of ancient European languages, like Old Norse and Old English and stuff. And as you've gotten to know Old English and the Old English literature, does that affect how you read modern or Lewis, Tolkien, and even modern fantasy writers? Like, do you see those things echoed in how in the stories they tell, or?
Oh yes, I mean Tolkien especially, because he was a major scholar of Old English and a major scholar of Beowulf. So he has a very, very direct connection to Old English. His work, I mean, there is just Old English present in Tolkien's work that is not mentioned as such, but the men of Rohan, their names are Old English. Theoden means Lord in Old English. So
Interesting.
there's a lot of just Old English sneaking around all over the place. Other examples, so the Darol, so Deagle, usually pronounced in modern English, Smeagol's friend. Those are
Uh-huh.
Old English words. Darol, or in different dialect, Deagle, which is secret. So there are all sorts of things that are hanging around in Tolkien's work that reward you if you know Old English.
Mm.
And of course, the stories that he tells are also also echo a lot of the themes of Old English literature, especially the idea of sneaking into a dragon's cave and stealing its treasure, and then the dragon coming out and wreaking havoc and having to be stopped by a hero. This is the content of the latter half of Beowulf.
Yeah.
So there are lots and lots of echoes, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of modern fantasy you can trace its roots very, very directly back to Old English literature. So if for those of you who are interested in fantasy literature, Old English is a very, very logical, very, very logical first step if you want to get into exploring the history of what made that literature the way it is. That and Old Norse.
Yeah, it's even the exposures I've gotten to things like reading Beowulf, even in translation, and other, poems from that period. And then I go back and I read like the way the way Tolkien narrates the Battle of the Pelennor Field and the charge of Rohan and before the gates of Gondor and stuff. And it just feels like, I know he's writing prose, but it feels like it's prose that's got a lot of poetry, like feeling of poetry. I mean, it's like he's writing with that sense of grandeur that you don't, that you get in some of these poems. And,
Yes, that's exactly what's going on. That's exactly what's going on. And Tolkien had a really amazing ability to shift his register depending on what he
yeah,
was describing. So you get very kind of plain spoken everyday language in some parts, and then you get this very, very elevated, almost poetic, heroic register when you getting to a section like the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. It's quite something. It's quite something. And knowing Old English, you can sort of see, in some ways it's hard because once you know Old English, you can see a lot of the stuff that he's doing. You can say, I see what you're up to there. So if you want to keep it completely, just stand in awe, then sometimes it's better not to know how the sausage is made. But I think it heightens your appreciation for the artistry to sort of see the tools that Tolkien was using.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. Um, so okay, so back to you, what you're currently working on. Thanks for indulging my random wanderings. I was trying to think like, okay, what's the, again, most people listening to this are Greek people, so thinking, okay, what's the payoff? What do you get by learning Old English? What can you read? What can you explore? Um, so that's kind of where some of my questions came from. But back to your project. So Oswald Bera, which I'm probably mispronouncing, um, is a sort of graded reader kind of textbook where you're getting vocabulary instructions introduced in a ordered way, so it eases with acquisition. And that's a fair assessment, I think, from what you said.
Yes.
Um, and you're teaching with the Ancient Language Institute. Do you have have you published the book anywhere at this point where someone could read it, or is it still so in development that you're kind of keeping it just as a in class text at the moment?
So currently the latter. Currently, it's only available as an in-class text through the Ancient Language Institute,
Mm-hmm.
and for the reason that you describe, basically we are road testing it. We have been road testing it for over a year now, and we're at the point where it's getting quite close to being ready for publication, at least in some maybe alpha version.
Yeah.
I want to get it out there so that people can start using it, and that it can be improved from their feedback and their experience. So we're hoping to get a version out, a version published by next year, maybe next summer.
Okay. And
Yeah.
and I remember, I don't know if it was where I read this, or maybe it was something I heard Luc Ranieri say, but like Lingua Latina was a life's work for Orberg, right? Like it's so good because he worked on it and revised it, which it sounds like that's what you're trying to do with this, is
Mhm.
run it through students and make changes.
It's improved so much from the experience of having used it with now uh, three three cohorts of students. No major changes, but there are always places where, okay, maybe this passage is a little too difficult, or maybe I haven't pushed enough in this chapter, or the vocabulary density is too much in this section. These are all things that you learn as you go through, and you see what questions students have, and what where they maybe get a little stuck, and you can always smooth. So I don't see, when it gets published next year, this will be, I'd like to think of it as the first word. It's not, certainly not the last word.
So just curious, how do you track? You've got to lay out a road and build complexity slowly. Like, how do you track and figure out that you've done that well as you're
Uh,
writing?
yeah, so I have a large spreadsheet. I
Nice.
have a Yes, and I have had some software help. So James Tauber,
Yep.
shout out to him. He gave me some code which for Greek, which I adapted for use with Old English. And so I'm running these scripts to go through, lemmatize, normalize the chapters, spit out vocabulary list, tell me when I'm introducing new things, how many in each chapter. So it wouldn't have been possible without that.
Huh. So it sounds like, just thinking for those who want to, maybe follow in your footsteps and with other things, there's tools that are out there if you know the right people and are willing to slog through, I guess, Python and other
Yeah.
bits of
It required
programming.
it required some Python knowledge to mess with. Fortunately, in a previous life, that was my job, so I was able
Okay.
to do that. But it's yeah, we're not yet at the point where we have tools that can be used by just anyone who doesn't have that background. We're still, I think, in sort of the early days of the support on building these things. Of course, standing on the shoulders of giants. I would
Yes.
never have been able to start without James's help. Um, but it does require a little bit of tweaking, especially to adapt to a new language. If I were working on Greek, it probably wouldn't have taken that much effort, because it was already in such a great state. But Old English is, certainly a different language, and it has different considerations that we don't have to deal with as much inflectional complexity as Greek does, but we have a lot more orthographic variation in the texts, even in
Oh,
the
right.
modern editions of the texts. There isn't the same push to normalize things for Old English texts. So you see it more or less as it is in the manuscript. And, at that time, there wasn't this idea that a word has a single spelling. People
Yeah,
just tried to, express what they said on the page. And so you'll get people spelling what we think of as the same word in 7 different ways on the same page. And that didn't seem to bother them, but it bothers us a lot. And it bothers computer programs
yeah,
quite a bit. So we have to account for that.
yeah. Because a computer, a thorn versus a th is two completely different things, and it's not going to give you parses the same unless you tell it that these two things are potentially equivalent.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
that
that
makes sense.
required some work. But fortunately, that was a sort of a one-time initial investment, and now the the code is up and running and can handle any text I throw at it, more or less.
That's really cool. So Colin, if people want to take classes with you, where you said Ancient Language Institute, where else can we find you and learn, keep up with? How can we follow your work as as
So
you're keep going?
you can check me out on Twitter at Colin Gorrie,
Okay,
Colingorrie.
right.
Also on YouTube under the same moniker. So I put out stuff on both those platforms, as well as on Substack. So it's everything's just under my name under the various platforms. But if you want to take classes, you go to Ancient Language Institute. So that's under ancientlanguage.com, and they've got Latin. We've got Latin, we've got Greek, we've got Old English, and we've got Biblical Hebrew.
Okay,
So I'm I'm currently the only Old English teacher there. So if you want to come and take Old English classes, that's how you do it.
very cool. Well, I really appreciate the time. I think there's some. I mean, it's just interesting to learn more about the history of literature that you know became modern English and things and influenced some really great writers. But I think some of your methods, the ways you learn, and the way you're teaching is really helpful for for learners of Greek. And I've got some ideas of things I want to try as I'm continually trying to grow. And then also just to see somebody else producing another, another resource in the style of Lingua Latina is really cool. And so I think there's some great tidbits in this conversation for creators as well. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I would like to just say, I know we have a lot of students and teachers of Greek in the audience. I would just say, when you study Old English, you're studying the earlier back you go in a language, the more in related languages, the more similar they are to each other.
Hmm.
So you will find, and I've certainly found this as I've been studying Greek after Old English, you will find so many parallels. You will learn about the sound correspondences between Old English and Ancient Greek, and you'll be able to start guessing words. And it's
Huh.
really, really quite cool to experience. So if you want to get a different perspective on Greek, you can come and take a vacation in Old English land, and it'll it'll teach you a thing or two. It's quite fun.
Well, and I found that too. Like I'm trying to work on Hebrew at the moment as well, and like I'll look at okay, what's this related to? So I'll try to see if my like sometimes Ron Drivers Briggs will list like Syriac words or all these other things. Like the more pegs you can hang a vocabulary item on, the easier it is to remember, I think. So that yeah, that would be being able to use Old English as a peg would be pretty cool, and vice versa.
Hmm. Yeah, I'll give you one example just as before I shut my mouth. So, poreuo, poreuo in Greek, poreuestai, uh, to go.
Yeah.
In Old English, a P in Greek corresponds to an F, usually in Old English. So,
Okay.
how do we say to go in Old English? Faran, faran. So that por goes into Old English as far, and that's pretty regular. So you can see these PF correspondences all over the place. That's called Grimm's law, by the way.
Interesting. Huh. Okay. Yeah, that's right. I saw someone I don't know if it was an interview here or something I read about how I think it was a Rob Words episode if you're familiar with that YouTuber. He was talking about how certain words go their pedigree goes back to, ancient Indo-European, and I believe that Grimm's law applied for explaining why the Greek and English words for to break wind are related.
Yep, that would make sense. PF.
Yep. So it's pretty funny. Well, again, Colin, I really appreciate it. I hope plan to keep an eye on your resources as they come out. And if I had unlimited time and money, I would definitely be in one of your classes. Because it just seems it's just such a cool thing to be able to read such ancient ancient literature about where we come from. And it's really exciting to see more resources being written in this style. So yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to chat with you today.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll hopefully maybe we'll have you back in a year or two as you can let us know how it's going.
Sounds good. Can't wait.
Intro and outro music is Funky Thanksgiving by Admiral Bob, used with gratitude under a Creative Commons 3.0 attribution license. The track can be found at dig.ccmixer.org.